Turning now to Venezuela, where the government is using food as a political tool. Socialist President Nicolas Maduro is up for re-election in May. He's now using scannable identification cards to see if people have voted. If they've voted, they get some food.
Venezuela is suffering through a horrific humanitarian and political crisis under Maduro's rule. Plunging global oil prices and failed economic policies have tanked the country's economy. For more now, we want to bring in CBSN contributor Alex Kliment. He writes for Signal, a newsletter produced by GZERO Media. So, Alex, you've covered what's happening in Venezuela extensively with Signal. Tell me what is sort of on your radar right now about Venezuela, because they've been in dire straits for a while.
Right. I think the crisis in Venezuela matters for a few reasons. Beyond the obvious, hideous humanitarian crisis that you mentioned, I think there's three things to look at. One is how the crisis in Venezuela affects Venezuela's neighbors. The refugee exodus from Venezuela right now is up there at Syrian levels of crisis, right? I mean, this is one of the biggest refugee crises in the world. The Colombians and the Brazilians are concerned about it. They've deployed troops to their borders to control the situation. Secondly, Venezuela is a major oil exporter, right? So any further crisis in Venezuela can affect energy prices. And thirdly, there's a geopolitical dimension here as well. The Russians and the Chinese have very close financial and political relations with the Venezuelan government. And in the event of any kind of collapse, they will be part of the scrum to try and figure out what happens next. So those three things, I think, all merit attention on Venezuela.
You mentioned China. It's a Chinese company that's developed the technology to power those identification cards. Why would they be involved in that aspect of this?
Well, the company ZTE is one of the largest telecommunications manufacturers in the world. Interestingly, this is a company that's come under scrutiny in the U.S. Under CFIUS regulations. They're looking at whether this company's bid to build contracts for 5G equipment in the United States would be a national security threat. But this is a company that has a long-standing relation in Venezuela and elsewhere in Latin America.
You mentioned that the refugee crisis is reaching Syrian levels, you said. Is it time for the international community to step in? Has anyone raised that?
Well, part of the difficulty is that the Venezuelan government themselves won't allow humanitarian aid to come in if it's coming from the U.S. But then there's also the question of whether sanctions are an effective tool to control the situation. You know, look, if you impose further sanctions on the Venezuela, who's going to suffer most are the people, not the government, right? Which actually perversely will increase the leverage that the government has to use food as a tool to ensure loyalty. So it's a horrible situation.
Yeah.
But explain why Maduro would be concerned about how people are voting when the elections are rigged, essentially.
So the big thing that the government's concerned about is turnout, right?
It's just like Putin, same situation, right?
Yeah, I got 90,
Putin wanted
whenever you're a dictator, you say I got 98% of the vote.
Yeah, so what does Maduro want to see? What's his ideal number? Has
well,
he
I don't know what
it?
the ideal number is, but part of the problem is that the opposition has decided to boycott the vote, right? So what the government wants to see is as much turnout as possible to make it look as legitimate as possible, right? And of course, from the average Venezuelan's perspective, they don't know whether the government can tell who they voted for or not, right? When they say, well, we're going to check your ID card to see if you voted, you know, whether the technology doesn't permit them to know who you voted for, but you know, you might suspect that they certainly could know who you voted for.
Alex, we've been talking we've been going deep into this story, and it's important, I think, for people to know what's going on there. But just take a step back and explain for an audience that may not understand why a country that is so rich in natural resources like Venezuela is, particularly with oil, how they find themselves in a situation like this.
Well, part of the problem is that the actual oil production itself was so heavily politicized, right? Around 2003, 2004, the government removed all of the best oil engineers and specialists and put in political appointees to run PDVSA, which is the national oil company, which started a long process of production decline. Right, you had incompetent political appointees running the oil company, and also the government of Hugo Chavez used oil revenues essentially to buy off elites and also to create unsustainable populist spending policies that, when the oil production fell and oil prices fell, became unsustainable. Right. So it's a mixture of politicization and economic incompetence that has gotten Venezuela to this point.
It's truly a tragedy because it is essentially man-made. It never had to be like this, and you know, it had to do with a government that people had high hopes for. They really thought this was going to be a man of the people.
Well, and Chavez came to power because there was gross inequality in Venezuela up until that point. Let's not forget that this was, you know, hardly a happy situation before Chavez came to power, and that there were real social inequalities and economic inequalities that gave him fertile ground to come to power in the late 90s.
Indeed.